Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello and welcome to episode 23 of Stark Reflections. This is Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In this episode, I chat with Danièle Cybulskie about how she translated her passion for the Middle Ages into featured articles at medievalist.net that have reached more than 500,000 readers, how she's had her work as a subject matter specialist adopted for 9 Ontario colleges, and has created fun and informative books such as the 5-Minute Medievalist and 6 Steps to Better Historical Fiction, among many other great titles that she talks about. Not to mention her fascinating speaking gigs, including a TedX talk, and as an author coach, helping authors put more accurate history into their writing. But first I want to do a little bit of personal update, as I often do. BookNet Canada sent me just a few hours ago, this is Thursday, May 31st that I'm recording this. They sent me an advance edition of the results of their survey for the 2017 edition of the State of Digital Publishing in Canada. Now I know for those of you outside Canada that Canada is a small market compared to the US. Remember, the population of Canada is approximately the population of the state of California. But it is a parallel market, very similar to the U.S. market. So there might be commonalities in the trends in this report. So I think that's important. Now, I received this report because as a self-published author, I filled out the survey. Now, all the respondents, and I'm sorry, only Canadian authors and publishers can participate when they do this again next year, but all respondents get an advanced copy of the survey, which I just received. And so here are some highlights from it. Now, the responses came, 56% of the responders were defined as publishers, and 33% of them were defined as publishers/distributors. So that's like 89% of them were traditional published. So you got to keep that in mind and take that with a grain of salt. 11% of them were defined as self-published. So I was one of that 11%. So obviously a small number of self-published people filled out the survey. So you have to take that with a grain of salt and compare that to something where a data guy who tends to focus a lot on self-published titles and has a lot of data from there and is making assumptions based on traditional publishing, and then the pure traditional publishing results, which ignore digital in many, many ways, or they haven't paid as much attention to digital as indie authors are. So the results of this survey are going to skew more towards traditional publishing, but I think these stats are important to understand, particularly since many indie authors live inside significant echo chambers where they see publishing as 100% digital, when in fact digital is still a pioneering space in the overall larger publishing industry that is still heavily invested in shipping dead trees around into retail locations, or shipping dead trees through online retailers. So with that in mind, remembering those skews, here are some of the high-level trends that were reported. Print represented 75% of overall sales. Digital represented 23%. Audio represented 2%, and the category defined as other represented 3%. Now this is interesting. I know my own percentages that were reported were more along the lines of the following. So ignoring my other sources of revenue and just considering sales among print, ebook, and audio, ebooks accounted for 57% of my sales, print accounted for 41% of my sales, and audio under 2% of my sales. Now I'm sure that many self-pub and indie authors are going to see more along the lines of 90 to 95% ebook, maybe 2 to 10% print is something more normal. And that's probably to be expected, particularly in the US market, with Amazon as your central playing force, and maybe CreateSpace or KDP Print as the main source for your print revenue. But remember, I'm a hybrid author. I have several books in the traditional publishing and print world, and I also sell books directly in print via Comic-Cons and things like that, because the stuff that I write, the horror and ghost story stuff that I sell, because it sells in that market. So that's where some of those print sales are coming, that may not be as prominent for somebody who is mostly making a digital living. So again, I'm still, on that fence somewhere where ebooks are still the majority of my sales, almost 60% of my sales. Print is still 41%, but that's because I do have contracts with some traditional publishers. Now, other high-level things to note are no surprise to anyone who's been following digital trends in audiobooks. And that is that 61% of respondents were producing audiobooks in 2017. Again, remember, this is mostly traditional publishers that were responding to this survey. So if you're indie and you're producing audio, you're still ahead of perhaps a third of the mid-sized publishers in the industry in general. Again, extrapolating from Canada to the United States and the UK, etc. As English language territories. Now, in 2016, that number, which was 61% in 2017, in 2016, that number was 37%, and in 2015, it was 16%. So even in just the last 3 years, publishers are recognizing the growth of audiobooks. I think we're all recognizing the growth of audiobooks. And speaking of the growth of audiobooks, now I want to cut to the chase and get to a really fun tongue twister. Twisting by the, twisting by the, twisting by the, twisting by the, twisting by the fool, twisting by the fool, twisting by the fool. Such a fool. This week's tongue twister, sponsored by Findaway Voices, is in honor of Book Expo America, where several of the awesome Findaway folks are hanging out this week. They're hanging out in New York at Book Expo America, and that's why this tongue twister is in honor of them. There will be no special voice this time, but it's important for me to warm up because New York is part of this one. So I'm going to start spreading the news. Okay, don't worry, I won't sing. I do a horrible Frank Sinatra. Speaking of Frank Sinatra, I'm going to share a little bit of trivia that allowed me to win a radio contest this week. Yes, I'm going off on an aside, but hey, it's my podcast. I can do it if I want to. Did you know that for the movie Die Hard, the producers were obligated to cast Frank Sinatra in that role? Now, this is because of the movie The Detective that Frank Sinatra starred in years earlier, based on a novel by Roderick Thorpe. And that character, Joe Leland, was the main character, the detective. And they were obligated to, according to contractual obligations, provide the role in the movie that was based on a sequel that Roderick Thorpe wrote, offer that role to Frank Sinatra. Now, he was too old to play the role at the time, of course, and that's when they changed the character of Joe Leland into John McClane. They re-adapted that movie and obviously offered it to Bruce Willis. And the rest, of course, is John McClane history. But that was a bit of a trivia that you can use related to New York. Because John McClane was the cop from New York, remember, who went to L.A. That's what, how New York came into play, and Frank Sinatra and all those things. But let's get back to the tongue twister, shall we? You know New York, you need New York, you know you need unique New York. You know New York, you need New York, you know you need unique New York. You know New York, you need New York, you know you need unique New York. You know New York, you need New York, you know you need unique New York. Oh my God, I did it. This is awesome. You know New York, you need New York, you know you need unique New York. I'm going to just start saying that all the time now because I think I got it. I only messed it up once. So, special shout out to the good folks at Findaway Voices who are in New York, unique New York. And if you're looking for a unique way for you to control your audiobooks, to control the pricing, and to find some great narrators to work with, Findaway Voices distributes to the broadest possible spectrum of platforms, and I just had a book released recently through Findaway Voices using a narrator that I found through them and decided to use again. You can check them all out at starkreflections.ca/findaway. And now that we got that tongue twister out of the way, I wanted to also share some details about an experiment that I started this week on Kobo. As mentioned in previous podcast, last spring and summer 2017, I'd started to experiment with KDP Select exclusive titles, titles published only to Amazon or exclusively to Amazon, so I could leverage those crappy little promos that Amazon offers for giving them 90 days of exclusivity. Okay, I joke about this, but really, I'll give you 90 days of exclusivity and you give me 5 measly free days and a dinky little countdown deal that, if you run it without paying for a BookBub or a Bargain Booksy or ENT promo, is absolutely useless? Okay, I'm a little bit skeptical of that because it's never worked for me, but apparently it's worked for other people. They just have to push KDP Select exclusive and money starts flapping them in the face. All right. I'm just all on about the asides this week, aren't I? In any case, I tried that out and was looking for the potential increase from Kindle Unlimited reads. I did okay with it. I gave it a try. And while doing some of the paid promos, mostly on Bargain Booksy and Free Booksy, it was mostly positive for me. But I'm moving the titles wide because I think I can actually earn more that way. And again, you try the things that are important for you and you experiment with things that you think might work, and that's all you can do is try your own way in this publishing environment and experiment. So this is part of my publishing-wide experiment. I have the series of books that were called Nocturnal Screams, and each book's about 12,000 to 16,000 words. It's about 3 stories, all to a theme. Volume 1 is called Night Cries. Volume 2 is called Ode to Classics. And those 2 are both wide. Volume 3, which is coming to wide June 10th, just in a week or 2, is called Dark Shadows. Now, I have 7 volumes out in the series. The rest are still exclusive to Amazon. And I'm likely going to have 8 to 10 over the summer. So each is going to start with a Tour of Duty exclusive, see what I can do with it there, and then publish them wide. Because I don't want to go wide and then back to exclusive, because that's just a disaster waiting to happen. So it's easier to go from exclusive to wide. So I applied for the promo, I got accepted for the promo, and I paid Kobo via their internal promotions tool to have the book featured for the week on science fiction, fantasy, and horror section of the main page for free ebooks. Now, this is a highly searched and highly trafficked spot. It cost me $10 Canadian. So my goal for this was to A, get some reviews, B, get some increased ranking and visibility for this series, and C, get some sales of volumes 2 and eventually volumes 3, etc., as they begin to get published wide. Now, my sales at Kobo for the series are currently absolutely 0. Yay! My downloads of the free volume 1, which I published earlier in May, was at 5 units before I started this. 4 in Canada and 1 in the Netherlands. So, woohoo, 2 countries for me. Now, I started tracking the details of how effective this promo is for me. So far, just a high-level update, I'm up and to the right in my own small way. So I've moved from an average of 1 download a day to 11 downloads in the first day of the promo. The daily stats have continued to slowly increase. So I went to like 11 and 15, then 18. Now, no reviews yet. No sales of book 2 yet, but I'm going to be tracking that as well as the details, and I'll be sharing the high-level results next week here on the podcast. I have also shared, for those of you who are more visually inclined, a high-level version of it on a few graphs of this on my Patreon page, and I've shared that publicly, so you don't need to be a patron to see the high-level info. But it's a great place for me to store it easily and comment, etc., because it's sort of separate from the podcast, because it's a niggly little detail that I wanted to share. And for my patrons, because I want to ensure that they're getting additional value for their investment, I'm creating a detailed document that's currently about 30 pages that breaks down my daily results, my analysis, etc., because I'm going to be wanting to track this not just in the first week, but in detail over 6+ weeks to see what the long-term effects of this promotion might be at Kobo and whether or not it was worth it. So at Kobo, when you pay to be on one of the free promos, if it's a perma-free item, You're on that main page for that first week, the first 7 days. Then your stuff gets moved on the carousel to page 2, then page 3, then page 4. It never actually gets taken off there. So you're getting an echo positive effect for that first month, even though the biggest bang is that first 7 days when you're on the main page or the first page of the carousel of the promo. If you're in a feature spot, you get the feature spot, then you're on the first page of the carousel. So it's like a month and a week. But I want to see how that shakes out, and I want to see if it can help kickstart my series on Kobo, and then how that competes with the titles I'm still selling on Kindle. I want to see if I can actually get those sales right up there. I've actually also started to see some additional sales through iBooks and mostly through Nook in the last few weeks as well, which is kind of a neat growth to see. So we'll see what happens there. Now, of course, Amazon hasn't yet price matched Night Cries to free yet, so I can't do a free Booksy wide promo, for example, until that happens, which I'll likely do once I have books 3 and 4 up wide, because I'm going to do that free Booksy promo to Kindle, to Kobo, to Nook, to iBooks, to Google, make sure that I'm hitting all the places and see where it gets picked up. Because again, if I'm only getting right now, let's say 18 to 20 downloads a day on the title on Kobo, maybe I'm getting another 5 or 10 or 15 on another platform, or 50 or whatever. You never know. So that's the importance of going wide. In any case, I'm going to be sharing the details on the podcast. I'll be posting some of the visuals on Patreon. And speaking of Patreon, I wanted to give a shout out to new Patreon supporters this week, Jamie Davis. Thanks and welcome, Jamie. And thank you to all patrons of the show. Your support and your belief in what I'm doing here means a lot to me. Thank you for putting that faith and putting your pocketbook in that direction and supporting me. This is a reminder to Patreon supporters that I want to ensure you're getting value in the extra content. So if there's particular content that you're looking for either on the podcast or content that you want me to share on that exclusive Patreon account, let me know and I'll do my best to set that up for you. But now, that was enough of a bit of a preamble. Let's get to my interview with Danielle. Hi, Danielle. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, we are, we go back a little ways, you and I, in terms of the writing community, and we keep bumping into one another in different spaces, which is kind of cool. The last time we met, I hadn't realized just how much stuff you were doing to provide context for writers, and context that they really, really need. But I don't want to give that away. Why don't you share a little bit about what it is that you do that, provides writers with this great resource?
Well, I've been writing for medievalist.net for the better part of 10 years now. Yeah, maybe it's only 5, but it feels like a long time.
In digital age.
Yeah, well, someone counted once and said I had over 150 articles there, so that's quite a lot. And what I do there is share the most interesting stuff about the Middle Ages, the stuff that I think is really interesting, just the everyday details. And I decided that I would make myself a resource for writers, so now I'm becoming a coach. So people can use me as a resource and pick my brain, and I can tell them all sorts of the little things, like what people ate and where they went to the bathroom and what they wore and all those things. And I can coach people through saving them a whole bunch of time and research and helping them get the details right, which I think is really, really important right now.
Well, that's cool. So if I'm a writer and I use any sort of medieval, or what specific era are you focused on, or is your specialty, or do you do various historical periods as well?
Well, I only do the one, but that's kind of big. The medieval.
It's a long time period, right?
Yeah, the medieval period is 1,000 years, from about 500 to about 1500. So just after the Roman Empire and just before the Tudors, or just as Henry VII is coming to the throne. So that's 1,000 years, which is kind of a lot to take in.
Yes.
My favorite century is the 14th century. So that's the one with the Black Death and the 100 Years' War and stuff like that. And I think that's handy because a lot of people are writing books about that time. So It works pretty well.
And so a writer who has maybe already done a manuscript, is it almost like the way a developmental editor would go through and just look for continuity, but you would say, well, actually, this element here you need to tweak because it's got, what's an example of something that writers get wrong all the time?
Oh my gosh. A lot of times it's things like food, or writing implements or what people are wearing. I read a novel not too long ago in which somebody was wearing a petticoat, which they definitely were not wearing at that time.
Okay.
And so, it's details like that where I think it's important to get them right for two reasons. Number one, you don't want to be that guy that has the wrong information in your book. And number two, people are starting to learn their history from fiction and really want these things to be authentic. And they want to believe in it. So you don't want to lead them astray with things like, petticoats around 1300. It's just not going to work.
Okay. Well, but again, if the authenticity of what they're putting in their fiction takes the reader out of the story, that ruins that suspension of disbelief where you're saying, I'm willing to go along with the tale, but you got to at least get certain things right.
Yeah, and the problem with some mistakes is that, like you say, it pops you out of the story and then it throws all your other research into doubt. So you really want to have as much as possible correct in it. And I mean, there should be some room for poetic license. People change the dates sometimes of people's lifespans or tenure in their job, and I can understand that to serve the plot, but
Right.
I really want to try and get as many of the small details right as possible, just because it makes the rest of your work more credible, and I think it'll bring people back to the work that you're doing.
Is it too late once someone's written a manuscript to realize, okay, now I'm going to have someone go through and help me with it, or is it something that maybe writers would consider doing while they're outlining or plotting, because that could be a major plot point that it has to do with the petticoat that doesn't exist or something.
Yeah. Well, I'm open and willing and happy to help anyone at any stage in the process. Like, I can read it afterwards, but it would really be helpful to get that stuff out of the way first. And I think, especially because if it's your first or second time in the historical rodeo, you want to get the details right. So you don't want to have to spend all that time researching when you can have an expert help you. So yeah. And I picked a coaching model instead of a consultant model because I want to be able to help people solve these plot points.
Right.
You say you're writing something and you're like, I want the plot to go here, but I don't know how to get there in a way that's authentic. I'm happy to help people get there.
Okay. So if I'm getting all of my, my medieval era research from films, for example, I might believe that there was a holy hand grenade that existed, like in Monty Python's Holy Grail. And I don't think hand grenades existed back then, right? In King Arthur's time period. Is that possible?
There was gunpowder.
So they could have actually had explosives then.
Yeah. So there were cannons and stuff near the end of the medieval period. And if we're talking about Europe right now, mostly. I mean, they had gunpowder in China earlier than that.
Okay.
Yeah, but a holy hand grenade, no.
No, there's not such a thing. No, but that's true. But I didn't realize that they actually had gunpowder. And of course, China, with fireworks and all of the pyrotechnics that they have done so well.
That's right.
Yeah, I guess it goes way back.
Yeah, people were using cannons at closer to the end of the 100 Years' War, and that really changed warfare, and it changed. I mean, they had guns and things, so it changed how people were using their armor, how they were building their castles and things like that.
Really? So armor, because the armor, instead of it worrying about being pierced by a spear or a sword or an arrow, it may be pierced by lead.
Yeah.
Whatever they were putting in the.
Lots of things worked, right? But the guns weren't particularly accurate, so you're still better off using your longbow in many cases. But cannons really were game changers during the medieval period, for sure. So yeah, that's stuff that you want to know, especially if you're writing about soldiers during the 100 Years' War, which I've seen in a lot of novels, for example. Okay. But if you get your information from movies, it's not always going to be correct.
Right.
And, in a way that's fair enough because people are trying to entertain you, but we can do better. So that's what I'm here for, to help people make their stuff more accurate for everybody's sake.
Right. So we could figure out if the coconuts could have actually existed in England back in that century. Were they carried by pigeons or sparrows or whatever?
Well, the funny thing about Monty Python is that a whole bunch of the people who were in it were medieval scholars, especially Terry Jones. And the coconut thing, there is a scholar that's actually working on medieval coconuts right now.
Really?
Yeah. And she goes to museums and she finds coconut cups because
Okay.
of the huge trade network, global trade network that was happening at the time. So there are coconut cups in England that are medieval. So people weren't galloping around with the shells, but there was a bigger trade network and there was more diversity than we think. And so these are things that we can address and make our fiction better, both novels and film and TV.
And I think the last time that we were hanging out in person, I think you were telling me of the origin of certain foods. And one of my favorite foods in the entire universe is potatoes,
Yeah.
which I'd already assumed had come from Ireland. But you said no.
No. So we were talking about, a certain dinner theater that has a lot of foods in it that you wouldn't find in medieval Europe. And one of them is potatoes. One of them is tomatoes. Another one is corn. These are all ones that were brought to Europe from contact with the New World. So you wouldn't find them there. So this is another really common thing. People have feasts and people are eating things like turkey, which is also not medieval Europe because there was no contact with North America at that time. So I'd be happy to help people figure out what would be on the table, things like peacocks and swans and bleaks and things like that.
So there was poultry, but not the turkey.
Not turkey.
There was bird. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic because, again, it's those elements that really bring reality to the writing. Now,
Yeah.
I think you have done, I've seen a TEDx talk of yours, and you opened with one of those classic lines that we all learn from school. It was the rhyme that you learned from school.
Yeah. Yes, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, which he did.
Yeah. Was it blue? Or did it look more like London? Was it?
It was blue. But the tag on that, the thing that people always talk about in regards to Columbus is that he proved that the earth wasn't flat. And actually, no one thought that the earth was flat in the Middle Ages or before that. And you can see that in the TED Talk. The ancient Greeks had measured the earth. I've retweeted some stuff on my Twitter feed just today from the British Museum talking about their manuscripts and how they always envisioned the world as round. And if you've seen the TED Talk, you've seen the manuscript images.
Yes.
It's round. It's a globe. So this is the type of thing. I think enough historians are starting to talk about that on the internet, that you don't want to be that guy again that puts the flat earth in your book, because that will just throw everything else that you've worked on into doubt. And like you say, it ruins the story in a certain way. So let's get that stuff right so that we can have a better story.
Okay, cool. So this coaching that you do, which I think is absolutely essential and fantastic for writers, we will, of course, have links to your website for writers to check that out. But you have combined your own passion for history and your passion for writing, because you're also a writer, and you have a number of books out. You've blogged for years. You said 150 articles on this topic, and then you've also recently just signed a deal with a UK publisher, from what I understand.
That's right. So my first book I self-published, and actually that's where we met for the first time, was I was learning how to self-publish. And that was a collection of my blog articles, some of the most popular ones, called the 5-Minute Medievalist. And that actually has done a lot better than I expected. It really resonates with people. And the funny thing is, people are always surprised at how it resonates, which is flattering. So I also, on my website, I'm doing survival guides every month, and one that I've just kind of put into print and I'm going to put on Amazon is the Guide to Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse.
Which we all need. To be prepared, right?
That's right. My husband said, someday your knowledge is going to be useful. But I've just signed a deal. I signed one last summer to write a book that we're working with the title Medieval Europe in Fact and Fiction. And it's going to be for Pen and Sword Press. So it's going to be fairly short, but it's going to be kind of a guide to the type of things that we believe about the Middle Ages that are not necessarily true, and what is true. So that's going to be helpful for writers too, although it's not going to come out until next year. So you have to wait. You have to get in touch with me before then if you have questions.
Right. Well, we do have access to some of your other books that will be available online that we can probably get from the standard places.
Yeah. You can get the 5-Minute Medievalist as an ebook, and you can get it as a paperback.
Okay.
You can get it through Amazon. You can get it through Indigo. So,
oh, that's awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
So your interest in writing, I want to go back to that. Was it always writing about nonfiction? Was it always that helpful resource for writers, or were you interested in poetry or fiction or anything like that earlier?
Well, my master's degree is in English literature, but I kind of took as many history courses as I took English courses because I was just so interested in it, and I really got into the Middle Ages through the literature, especially Arthurian. But I never had any interest in becoming a writer per se. I was always kind of interested in teaching. But I had, and you see it at the beginning of my book, there's a little introduction. I had my first baby right after my master's degree, and I was sitting at home going, I have all this stuff in my head and I need to get it out. And, I can't just do play groups or I'm going to lose my mind. So I started to write for the internet, and medievalist.net found me. And then it kind of became a regular thing. But I kind of fell into writing. I was more about reading it. But I really felt like there was some outreach that needed to be done, because we really have a very negative impression of the Middle Ages, and much of it is incorrect. And I just felt like this time period is so vibrant and interesting, and I really felt like I needed to bring it to the people. So that's what I did.
Oh, that is cool. And I want to go back to that because you did, and I like what you did. So you had written these articles. You're like a columnist for this source that people can turn to. And then I guess because the way the rights worked, you own the rights, or they had non-exclusive rights to the material, which meant you could take the best of and put them into a book to make it easier, because not everyone reads on the internet, right? There are people who do still prefer a paperback or want to read it on their Kindle or Kobo or something like that.
Yeah, that's the thing. Those articles that I wrote, they have always been mine, and that was kind of the deal when I signed on. They were mine, and I've been really supported by medievalist.net in turning it into a book, because their mission is kind of the same as mine. It's just to educate people more about the period.
Okay.
So those were mine, and I was able to put them out there. And I kind of thought, because you could access a lot of this online and it's definitely cheaper to get the ebook, I really thought, I was going to sell a paperback to my parents and my grandparents, and that would be it.
Yeah.
But people love having a paperback, especially to have it on the shelf next to their favorite things, so they can come back to it and look at stuff again.
Right.
That particular book, the 5-Minute Medievalist, it has just stuff on everything. It has stuff on language. It has stuff on the real Ulrich von Liechtenstein from A Knight's Tale. It has stuff on, 5 great ladies who refuse to be quiet. So there is something for everybody in it. And people really like having a paper book, I think.
Yeah. Apparently, as you can see behind me, this is like all reference material here. So
and a lot of skulls.
and some skulls. They're not the skulls of my enemies. They're just novelty ones.
That's a missed opportunity right there.
Yeah. No. Did people actually collect skulls of their enemies at any point in 1,000 years?
Gosh, it wasn't. Certainly not in later Middle Ages. The Vikings were less squeamish about that kind of thing.
Right.
I can't really think of a time in which they were like drinking the wine of the skull of their enemies, but they certainly weren't as squeamish about skulls as we are now, for sure.
Of course, yeah. We are very squeamish about them.
Yeah, not you though.
No, apparently no, not squeamish about them at all. So you started the writing when you had the little one, and you were, we've got all of this information swirling around that you wanted to share.
Yeah,
that led to, blog where people are discovering your content and still enjoying it to this day. Now you have the curated material, which is, the best of, where people can own a copy, put it on the shelf, and quickly refer to it.
Yeah.
And then you've got the book coming out with Pen and Sword.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, Pen and Sword publisher, which is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the other things that you have been working on lately that you're really excited about?
Well, I'm happy to be doing these survival guides each month. It was kind of a challenge that I set for myself because, again, I really wanted to reach out to the people who have an interest in the Middle Ages and really kind of show how these elements of the Middle Ages are so relevant today. So the first one I did was the Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse, which I really enjoyed doing.
Yeah.
I thought it was fun and a lot of stuff is relevant. And the stuff that I have in there is actually based on medieval technology, so medicine and building and weapons things. So the next one I did was a guide to defeating your superhero nemesis, your comic book nemesis.
Right.
So that one was kind of based around Infinity Wars and free comic books.
Good timing.
Yeah. So, well, because I really feel these connections are real. Stories that we tell of heroes, it's not a new thing, So
Right.
we'll have that, and then the next one's just been voted on by Twitter, and it's going to be the 5-Minute Medievalist Guide to Surviving a Romance Novel. So
Oh, awesome.
that's going to be fun. So I write them, at the end of each month, so they come out at the beginning of the month. Beyond that, I'm teaching again a course that I helped create for Conestoga, and it's an Ontario Learn online course
Right.
called The Middle Ages and the Modern World, Facts and Fiction. So that's just started. So I'll be doing that for the summer, which is fun too.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
fantastic. And so what do you read for pleasure? Do you read historical fiction, or what is it? What keeps you what's on your bookshelves lately?
Oh my gosh, I read widely, but I find the stuff that I enjoy the most is futuristic stuff. Because one of the things that I like about the Middle Ages is trying to figure out how they dealt with a lot of these situations. So the century that I like learning about the most is the 14th century, which was huge, like huge amount of disasters. There was famine, there was plague, there was war, and you really want to find out, or I want to find out, how people dealt with that, and what their technology was at that time. And it's hugely inventive, right? And so when I project myself forward into a lot of dystopian stuff, I like to see how people are dealing with that situation as well. So I think that's what resonates with me. I do love a good historical fiction novel if it's done well, or if it has, I don't have, it doesn't have to be perfect, because I do think that there aren't a lot of resources for writers at the moment, which is why I'm trying to fill that gap. But it has to be a good story. You have to like the people. You have to like where it's going. And my favorite medieval movie is probably A Knight's Tale, which is supposed to be kind of crazy, but it really gets at just how that period was fun and people were people at that time. And so, yeah, I like historical fiction too, but I find the books that I've most enjoyed lately have been dystopian futures. Actually, I don't know what that says about me.
Well, no, it's interesting. Maybe because you look at a lot of times dystopia comes with either having technologies removed, so some people don't have access to it,
That's
or
right.
something so bad has happened that there is no like there's no more electricity.
Yeah,
So you're going to an era where, yeah, how would people survive? And you have an insight into how people lived with different technologies or different government systems and kings and queens, and right, not the
yeah,
capitalism that we're so familiar with in modern history.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, there's a certain insight, and you kind of imagine forward to thinking we had these things and they were amazing, now they're gone, now what are we going to do? And that's kind of interesting. I think it's Station 11, which is a great novel that kind of talks about telling future generations, we used to have these things that would fly in the sky and take people places. It sounds crazy. So it's interesting to me to think about looking back to this time, and maybe that's the historian in me looking back to the Middle Ages as well. Yeah.
That's cool, because you know what, we need to understand our history better in order to understand the future. I think it's really important.
Yeah, and as I've been thinking of it more and more people have been asking, what is it good for? I think that if we look back through history, and we look at what they were doing then, what they were interested in, what they love, what they hate, we could really see that it hasn't changed that much.
Right.
And I said this in my TED talk, you can read something from a really long time ago and it sounds familiar because people haven't changed very much. And so I think that bridging that divide through time really gives you a compassion for people who are in a different culture than your own. And I think that that can be extended right now to having compassion for people in a different culture that are alive right now. So
Right.
for me, it's understanding and it's compassion. That's really what you can get out of learning from history.
Oh, that is fantastic. Well, thank you for taking the time to hang out with me today. Where can people find out more about you? Where can they find links to your books, etc.?
Right. Well, I have links to everything on my website, which is daniellecybulskie.com, which I'm hoping you put in the show notes because I am aware of how difficult it is to spell. And there, if you go to writing, you can find the book, you can find the articles, you can find the survival guides, and a free book on better historical fiction, which you can get. Just sign up for the mailing list. If you
Awesome.
look on speaking, you can see my TED Talk. If you look under coaching, you can see what I offer people. And it goes everywhere from I will give you a list of good reading that's appropriate to your work, or we can work on it together. So everything is on the website. You can find it all there.
Oh, that is fantastic. Thanks so much. And I'm looking forward to checking more of this out.
Thanks, Mark.
I regularly spend more time in the after interview notes talking about the business of writing and publishing than I do on the craft. But after listening to Danielle talk about the importance of accurately portraying historical elements in your fiction via actual fact rather than assumed or Hollywood created fact, it reminded me of the type of research I often have to do for my own writing, which is more related to craft in a way. Now, most of my fiction is set in relatively modern times, so the research involved is usually surrounding a place or perhaps details about the profession of one of my characters or something like that. But my nonfiction books, the ghost story ones that I write for Dundurn, usually involve history, because in many ways you can't tell a ghost story without delving into some sort of history. And when sharing ghost stories of particular historic buildings, the history can indeed be rich. Now, I've never been a huge fan of history, unlike Danielle, who's very passionate about it. Now, I was going on a ghost walk in Ottawa years ago when my eyes were first opened to just how fascinating history can be. And for every single book I've released so far, there have been 5 of them, the 6th one is coming this fall, I've learned something intriguing or fascinating that I hadn't known before. I might just be able to use one of the things that I learned in a fictional tale somewhere in the future, but in the meantime, I've learned it for the nonfiction writing. Such as, to give you an example, in recently writing a chapter for the forthcoming Macabre Montreal that I'm co-authoring with Shana Krishnasamy, I learned about the flying canoe or the chasse galerie, which is an image that I've seen all over Canadian and in particular Quebec culture, including on a brand of beer I have quite enjoyed. But I never understood the origin of this classic tale, which happened to be a deal with the devil tale penned in 1892 by Honoré Beaugrand. Now that is something I learned for a chapter when I was working on Macabre Montreal. And it might be a tale that I allude to in a future deal with the devil story that I write, because I've written deal with the devil stories, and because we do tuck these things away to use in other tales eventually. And I can assure you that the next time I'm at a bar that happens to have Maudite by Unibrow Brewery on tap there, I'll do my best to captivate my bar companions with the original story of that flying canoe that appears on the tap handle or on the bottle of beer. I mean, who knows? It might just earn me a free beer for my trivia. And heck, I'd take that. I won a radio contest earlier this week for my trivia. love to have a $8 beer for my trivia, because after all, an $8 beer is like selling 23 books on Kindle at 99 cents. Now, Danielle and I, after our interview, were discussing putting together a webinar to help writers with some of the basic facts they should know for penning historical fiction. Commonly held beliefs that she can help them steer away from. And we haven't composed the details, but I'm sure we'll brainstorm something the next time we see each other at the Canadian Association of Professional Speakers meetings in Toronto. In the meantime, I encourage you to check the show notes at starkreflections.ca to check the link to her intriguing TED Talk about Columbus and the Flat Earthers. Now, why do Flat Earthers keep coming up in this podcast lately? Is there some Flat Earth conspiracy following me around the globe? Did you get that? Flat Earth conspiracy following me around the globe? Okay, bad dad joke there. In any case, I think it's time for me to stop. Thanks for listening to episode 23 of the Stark Reflections podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, feel free to give it a positive review or share it with a friend that you think might enjoy or benefit from it. And if you have any questions, any comments, or feedback, you can leave them in the comments at starkreflections.ca. You can ping me via Twitter at Mark Leslie, or email me at mark@markleslie.ca. So until next week, I wish you good writing and good reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.